Picture this. You find yourself in the heart of Renaissance Rome in the year 1502. The Vatican's marble halls seem to breathe with history, their cool surfaces glimmering in the light of countless torches and candles. The air is heavy, thick with the aroma of roasted peacock, cinnamon-spiced wine, and honeyed almonds. But beneath that sweetness there lingers something sharper, the metallic tang of power. This is not merely a feast, it is a display, a performance. A union of staggering political importance is about to be sealed. At the center of it all is a young woman draped in silk and jewels, Lucrezia Borgia, 22 years old, golden-haired, and already infamous. She is the daughter of Pope Alexander VI, one of the most controversial pontiffs in all of papal history. Tonight she is the bride, but the Vatican's courtiers, ambassadors, and nobles know better than to mistake this glittering moment for a love story. The silk draperies shimmer, the banquet tables groan under the weight of pheasants and pastries, but none of it conceals the truth. This marriage is not about affection. It is about survival, leverage, and the desperate attempt of two powerful houses to outwit their rivals in Italy's never-ending chessboard of blood and power. Lucrezia's new husband is Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. To the outside world, it appears a match of triumph for the Borgias, proof that their papal dynasty, once dismissed as upstart Spaniards, has forced its way into the highest ranks of Italy's nobility. Yet everyone in this hall knows the price such alliances demand, and before the night is over, this celebration, this carefully staged show of magnificence, will twist into something grotesque. Lucrezia's marriage bed will become a stage, her body a guarantee, her privacy a matter of negotiation. But for now, the spectacle is still in motion. Guests murmur behind jeweled masks, eyes flickering toward the papal throne where Alexander VI presides. His fleshy hands, heavy with rings, rest on the gilded arms of his chair, and his expression betrays the satisfaction of a man who believes he has secured another victory. Nearby, Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's ruthless brother, watches like a hawk in polished armor. He is the sword of the family, the one who clears obstacles with blade or poison, and even amid the merriment, courtiers glance at him with a mix of fear and awe. Lucrezia herself plays her role with practiced elegance. She smiles where she must, bows where protocol demands, and dances with the poised grace expected of a papal daughter. But behind her composure lies a lifetime of lessons. This is her third marriage. She knows well that her hand is not her own to give, that every vow she makes is her father's contract, every smile her brother's signature. She has learned to adapt, to endure. If her first marriage was annulled under humiliating claims of her husband's impotence, and her second ended with a beloved husband bleeding to death on the Vatican steps, this third will not catch her unprepared. She has seen enough of love betrayed, of loyalty punished, to know what kind of game she is playing. The feast stretches on hour after hour as poets declaim verses, musicians pluck their lutes, and dancers whirl in shimmering silks. Foreign envoys watch with calculating eyes, measuring every detail of the night like accountants of power. They know what is at stake. In the viper's nest of Renaissance Italy, where cities and duchies fall as swiftly as the roll of dice, marriage is not a sacrament, but a treaty written in flesh and sealed in blood. And yet the tension lingers, unspoken but palpable. For the Este family of Ferrara, old and proud, This union is not fully trusted. They look upon the Borgias with suspicion, new money, new power, too ruthless, too sudden. The Este are steeped in tradition, with centuries of rule behind them, while the Borgias are whispered to have clawed their way up with poison and corruption. For the Este, this marriage is a gamble, one they will demand proof of before their heir's fate is tied too tightly to the Borgia's ambition. As the night wears on, the golden light of the Vatican halls grows softer, the revelry more languid, and the shadows lengthen along the marble walls. Soon the true purpose of the evening will be revealed. What masquerades as a celebration will collapse into something darker, something that strips away the silks and music to expose the raw mechanics of power. For tonight, Lucrezia will not be simply a bride, she will become a symbol, a contract, a body transformed into proof. And what happens behind those parted curtains will echo through the courts of Italy, whispered of in Venice and Milan, gossiped about in Florence, and remembered for centuries. This is the story of how a woman's most intimate moment was weaponized, and how she, in turn, would learn to weaponize the humiliation forced upon her. Tonight the candles burn bright, the goblets overflow, and the dancers twirl. But beneath the glitter of Rome's most decadent feast lies the sharp edge of cruelty. The stage is set, and the curtain is about to rise to understand the grotesque demand that would follow Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night. You must first understand the world in which she lived. Renaissance Italy was not a unified nation, but a fractured mosaic of cities-states, duchies, and republics, each a glittering jewel set into a crown of daggers. Power was fragile, shifting with alliances as fickle as the seasons, and survival depended less on honor and more on cunning. The great powers of the peninsula, Venice, Florence, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States, were locked in a perpetual game of rivalry and deception. Venice, with its merchant fleets and shimmering canals, thrived on trade, but wielded armies when profit demanded. Florence, a republic in name but dominated by the Medici family, was both a cradle of art and a furnace of intrigue. Milan was the fortress of condottieri mercenary generals who bought and sold their loyalty like fine cloth. Naples, vulnerable to the ambitions of France and Spain, balanced precariously on the edge of foreign conquest. And at the center of this tangled web sat Rome, its spiritual authority cloaking what was, in truth, a temporal kingdom ruled by popes who wielded armies, dispensed favors, and made war as any other prince. This was not an era of chivalry, it was a viper's nest. Marriages were treaties, dowries were weapons, and bedrooms were battlefields. The banners of alliances rose and fell like the tides. A banquet toast could signal friendship one week, and the same lips might issue a declaration of war the next. Poison was as common a tool as the sword. Mercenary captains switched sides mid-battle. Assassinations unfolded in cathedral doorways. Nothing was sacred, not even the sacraments themselves. For the Borgias, who hailed from Spain and had clawed their way to the pinnacle of papal power, this instability was both a danger and an opportunity. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, had no illusions about sanctity. He saw the papacy as a throne, not a ministry, and used it with ruthless pragmatism. With his illegitimate children openly acknowledged and his coffers swollen from the sale of indulgences and benefices, Alexander treated Rome as a family enterprise. He was determined to carve a dynasty into the marble of Italy. one that could outlast the whispers of scandal and secure its place among the ancient families of the peninsula. But the Borgias were always outsiders. To the proud Italians, they were foreign usurpers, interlopers who wielded power too brazenly and with too little regard for decorum. Their Spanish roots marked them as different, their methods as vulgar. The Italian nobility spoke of them with a mix of envy and disgust because the Borgias had achieved what few others could, disgust, because they achieved it through methods too shameless to be denied. Rumors of incest between Lucrezia and her father and brother spread like wildfire, though no proof was ever shown. Tales of poison-filled rings and secret midnight murders added to the legend. Whether true or invented, the gossip served its purpose: to brand the Borgias as dangerous, unnatural, and unworthy of trust. Yet in this Italy, trust was a fiction anyway. Alliances were fragile things, made and unmade by marriages. A pope's daughter was worth more than 1,000 mercenaries if she could secure the loyalty of a duchy. A dowry could buy soldiers, a bride could bind families, and the fertility of a young woman could secure dynasties for generations. This was the currency of power, and Lucrezia was one of its most valuable coins. The Este family of Ferrara understood this all too well. Their duchy, though wealthy and respected, was not immune to the storms of Italian politics. They had seen kingdoms collapse overnight, noble houses disgraced by rumors, heirs undone by whispers of impotence or barrenness. To tie themselves to the Borgias was both a prize and a peril. On one hand, they would gain the protection of the papacy and the fearsome shadow of Cesare Borgia. On the other, they risked contamination from the very scandals that had made the Borgias infamous. And so, when the marriage was arranged, they resolved to leave nothing to chance. The proof of the union had to be undeniable, not whispered behind curtains but certified in flesh. It was, by their logic, the only way. In a land where alliances could be annulled as easily as vows, where priests bent scripture to suit politics, the body itself became the only trustworthy ledger. If Lucrezia and Alfonso consummated their marriage, witnessed by impartial eyes, then no annulment could later claim impotence or fraud. The Este would have their guarantee, and Lucrezia, once again, would be reduced to a function, not a daughter, not a bride, but a vessel whose worth lay in what she could prove. This was Italy at the dawn of the 16th century. Brilliant, treacherous, dazzling, and grotesque. A place where Michelangelo carved David in Florence, while mercenaries butchered peasants in Lombardy, where Raphael painted Madonnas for popes who fathered children with mistresses, where scholars rediscovered Plato while princes strangled their rivals in bedchambers. It was a world of light and shadow, beauty and corruption, genius and cruelty intertwined. And in this world, Lucrezia Borgia was about to play her most dangerous role yet. At the center of this perilous game sat one of the most infamous families in European history, the Borgias. To their admirers, they were brilliant tacticians who transformed the papacy into a dynasty to rival kings. To their enemies, they were devils in silk, their very name a synonym for corruption, lust, and poison. For Lucrezia Borgia, it was both her inheritance and her curse. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia Better, known as Pope Alexander VI, was no shepherd of souls. He was a man of appetite, both earthly and political. Elected in 1492, his pontificate was a scandal in itself, funded by bribes and secured by alliances forged in smoke-filled conclaves. He openly acknowledged his children, an act shocking enough in a man of the cloth. But what disturbed the noble families of Italy was his determination to use them as tools of power. Where another pope might have sought to defend the church, Alexander sought to build a dynasty, and Rome became less the Holy See than the family estate of the Borgias. Beside him stood Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, the dark star of Renaissance politics. Once a cardinal, Cesare shed his red robes for armor, trading the pulpit for the sword. With the backing of France and the gold of the papacy, he carved out a personal state in central Italy, reducing cities like Forlì and Rimini through a mix of cunning, brutality, and terror. Niccolò Machiavelli, who observed Cesare firsthand, would later immortalize him in The Prince as the model of cold-blooded statecraft, the man who understood that it is better to be feared than loved. To many, Cesare was the true ruler of the Papal States, his father merely providing the papal seal to sanctify his conquests. And then there was Lucrezia Beautiful, blonde, and, in the popular imagination, poisonous. Rumors clung to her like a second skin. Whispers of incest with her father and brother, stories of secret banquets where lovers were dispatched with poisoned wine, tales of a ring hollowed to carry venomol of these swirled in taverns and courts alike. Whether true or false mattered little. Scandal had its own kind of truth in Renaissance Italy. For enemies of the Borgias, Lucrezia was the perfect symbol of their corruption, a woman soiled by her own family, a temptress with a deadly smile. Yet the reality was more complex. Beneath the shadow of her father and brother, Lucrezia had little agency in her early life. She was moved across the board like a pawn, betrothed, married, and discarded according to the needs of the family. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was arranged when she was barely a teenager, intended to secure an alliance with Milan. But when that alliance soured, her father annulled the union on the grounds that Giovanni was impotent. It was a lie, a humiliation so profound that Giovanni was driven to rage and bitterness, but it freed Lucrezia to be used again. Her second marriage seemed different. Alfonso of Aragon, young and handsome, was said to have genuinely captured her heart. For a time, there were whispers of affection between them, of laughter in the gardens and tenderness in the halls. But in the merciless world of Italian politics, affection was a liability. Alfonso became an obstacle to Cesare's ambitions, and one night he was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Stabbed and left bleeding, he clung to life for weeks until stranglers finished the work. Few doubted whose hand was behind it. Lucrezia, barely 20, was left widowed and shattered, her name once again entangled in scandal and blood. This was the world that had shaped her by the time she stood as bride to Alfonso d'Este. Twice married, twice discarded, her reputation in tatters, she was already considered a woman marked by misfortune. The Este family, proud and cautious, saw not only her beauty and her papal dowry, but also the trail of ruined men behind her. They were not fools. They had seen how the Borgias used marriage as a weapon and discarded husbands when their purpose was served. To bind their heir to such a woman was dangerous, unless every possible doubt could be stripped away. For the Borgias, however, Lucrezia was still invaluable. She was their coin in the marketplace of power, and her dowry was no trinket. Alexander VI poured wealth into her marriage contract, jewels, land, and promises of papal favor so that Ferrara could not easily refuse. The Pope knew what he was buying: legitimacy for his family name, a tie to an ancient dynasty that could anchor the Borgias in Italy's aristocratic order. And so, the stage was set. The Borgias had played their hand with typical audacity, binding their scandalous daughter to one of the proudest houses in Italy. But the Estensi of Ferrara would not enter the trap blindly. They demanded proof, ironclad and humiliating, before the ink on the contract could truly dry. By the year 1502, Lucrezia Borgia had already lived the kind of life that would have broken most women twice her age. At only 22, she was twice married and twice cast aside, each time her body and reputation weaponized in the great chess game her family played with the rest of Italy. To the outside world, she was a daughter of scandal, a pawn of her father, the Pope, and her brother, the warlord. But to those who looked closer, she was also something else, a survivor learning, piece by piece, how to turn her enforced humiliations into instruments of strength. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, was arranged when she was still barely more than a child. The Sforzas were powerful, tied to Milan, and the union promised to strengthen Borgia influence in the north. For a few brief months, the match seemed stable enough, but politics in Renaissance Italy moved like quicksilver. When Cesare Borgia shifted his alliances toward France, the Sforzas became less useful, even dangerous. The easiest solution was to undo the marriage, but annulments required justification, and so the Borgias manufactured one. Giovanni, they declared, was impotent. The charge was devastating. In an era when a man's virility was tied directly to his honor, impotence was not only a private failure, but a public disgrace. Giovanni protested furiously, even going so far as to claim that the Borgias themselves engaged in incesta, desperate attempt to wound them in return. But it did not matter. Rome believed what Rome was told, and Giovanni was ruined. For Lucrezia, the annulment was a humiliation as well, her body treated as evidence in a trial she had no voice in. She was left to carry the stain of gossip, her virtue questioned, her private life dragged into the courts of men. Yet she endured, her silence and composure making her seem pliable, obedient, qualities that kept her useful to her family. Her second marriage could not have been more different. Alfonso of Aragon, illegitimate son of the King of Naples, was young, handsome, and by all accounts charming. Against the odds, Lucrezia found herself in something dangerously close to love. Contemporary chroniclers describe her laughing with him, spending hours in his company, enjoying a tenderness rarely afforded to her in the brutal marketplace of dynastic politics. For once, it seemed, she was not merely a pawn, but in the viper's nest of Renaissance Italy, love was weakness. Alfonso's ties to Naples placed him on the wrong side of Cesare Borgia's ambitions. Naples stood in the way of Cesare's dream of carving out a kingdom in central Italy, and alliances with the French made Alfonso expendable. In July 1500, as he walked near the steps of St. Peter's, assassins struck. Alfonso was stabbed, left bleeding and broken. For weeks he lingered, clinging to life while Lucrezia nursed him with desperate devotion. She begged her father and brother for mercy, but mercy was not in the Borgia vocabulary. When the knives failed, stranglers finished the job. The murder was an open secret. Rome whispered, and Ferrara, Florence, and Venice listened carefully. Cesare's hand was obvious, and Lucrezia's grief was plain. She had lost not just a husband, but perhaps the only man she had truly loved. And yet, she survived. If her first annulment had taught her how easily her honor could be stripped away, her second widowhood taught her something even harsher. In her world, affection was a liability, and loyalty was fatal. By the time negotiations began for her third marriage, Lucrezia was no innocent girl. She was a woman seasoned in blood and betrayal, but she was also a woman marked. Her reputation tainted by scandal. To many in Italy, she was damaged goods, her body carrying the shadow of ruined husbands and whispered poisons. Her name, once an asset, now threatened to be a liability. Yet Alexander VI was determined. He could not allow his daughter's scandals to outweigh her value. He poured wealth into her dowry states, jewels, even promises of papal military support to sweeten the bargain with Ferrara. Cesare, too, pressed for the match, knowing that tying their family to the ancient and prestigious Este dynasty would anchor the Borgias among Italy's true aristocracy. For the Borgias, Lucrezia's body remained the most valuable coin they had to spend. The Este, however, were no fools. They saw the history written behind her eyes: a first husband ruined, a second murdered, a woman who carried scandal wherever she went. They weighed the risks carefully. To bind themselves to the Borgias might bring papal favor, but it might also stain them with scandal or even doom their heir. They needed guarantees, and so, from the ashes of her earlier humiliations, a new one was about to be forged, an even more grotesque, even more public. The Este would not accept whispered assurances or papal promises. They would demand proof that Lucrezia was fertile, that Alfonso d'Este was virile, and that this union could not be undone by claims of impotence or barrenness. They would demand proof written not in contracts, but in flesh. The negotiations for Lucrezia Borgia's third marriage had been long and fraught. The Este family of Ferrara, one of the oldest and proudest dynasties in Italy, understood the stakes as well as the risks. Their duchy was wealthy, cultured, and politically strategic, a jewel in the north of Italy. Aligning themselves with the papacy could secure their future against the tides of war that constantly threatened to wash across the peninsula. But tying their heir to the daughter of Alexander VI was no ordinary gamble. The Borgias carried wealth, influence, and military power, but also scandal, poison, and the stink of ruin. Lucrezia's name had already been splashed across Italy's rumor mills. One husband publicly declared impotent, another brutally murdered, both exits orchestrated to serve her father and brother's shifting needs. To the Este, this was a dangerous pattern. They were not merely marrying into papal favor, they were binding their bloodline to a family that devoured husbands when they were no longer useful. Thus the Este courtiers devised a safeguard, grotesque by modern standards, but in their minds, logical and necessary. They demanded proof. The marriage must not only be celebrated with feasts and pageantry, it must be consummated under the watchful eyes of witnesses. No whispers, no doubts, no chance that the union could later be annulled on the grounds of impotence or fraud. The act had to be verified like a treaty signed with ink, or in this case, with flesh. To us, the notion is appalling. A bedroom turned into a courtroom, intimacy reduced to spectacle, privacy stripped bare before a select audience of clerics, envoys, and notaries. But to the Est, this was simple prudence. In Renaissance Italy, annulments were weapons. Entire alliances had collapsed because a husband was declared impotent or a wife barren. Kings and popes alike had used the bedroom as a battlefield. For the Este, who saw their proud lineage threatened by the scandalous Borgias, certainty was worth any humiliation. So alongside the feasts and the celebrations, arrangements were made. A chamber was prepared, not unlike a stage, with curtains that could be drawn to allow glimpses inside. The Este envoys would be present, solemn and clinical, joined by papal clerics who would verify the act. They were not there to revel in salaciousness, but to record, to note, to certify that the marriage had been sealed in flesh. The bride and groom were to become performers in a ritual of power, their bodies serving as contracts written in skin. And though such public consummations were rare, they were not without precedent. Throughout Europe, there had been customs of witnesses to marriage beds, of bed sheets displayed to prove a bride's virginity, of tokens paraded to reassure anxious families. What made Lucrezia's situation different was its theatricality and its purpose. This was not about family honor or private reassurance. This was about politics, and the witnesses were not kinsmen but envoys, men whose reports would ripple outward to courts across Italy. The Este were determined to eliminate every loophole. Lucrezia's previous marriages had left scars on her reputation, and they feared those scars could be wielded against their heir. If later someone attempted to annul the union by claiming Alfonso d'Este was impotent, the Este could raise their certified testimony. If whispers spread that Lucrezia was barren, they could point to the public consummation as proof of her capability. It was, in their eyes, the only way to armor themselves against the venom of politics. For Lucrezia, however, it was yet another humiliation carved into her life. Her body, already treated as collateral in two failed alliances, was now to be exhibited as proof. She was no longer a bride entitled to the dignity of privacy, but a living guarantee, a vessel whose most intimate act was to be transformed into a ceremony. She had no choice. The Borgias needed the alliance, and the Este demanded their price. The guests who had filled the Vatican halls with laughter and feasting would eventually return to their homes, remembering not only the peacocks and the dancers, but also the whispered knowledge of what would follow. Everyone knew what was coming. The wedding feast was the prelude, the stage setting for the true performance of the night. The Este had made their grotesque requirement clear, and the Borgias had accepted it. And so, as the candles burned low and the musicians' strings fell silent, the court prepared for an act that would blur the line between ceremony and violation. Lucrezia, once again, was about to be reduced to her function, her body pressed into service not by choice, but by necessity. At last the moment arrived. The banquet fires dimmed, the poets had exhausted their verses, and the dancers' feet fell still. A hush spread through the Vatican's glittering halls as the bride and groom were led away. But unlike other weddings, where a couple slipped quietly into a private chamber, Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este were guided into a space prepared like a stage. The curtains were heavy but parted just enough so that chosen eyes could peer in. Behind them stood the witnesses, clerics, envoys, and notarius, solemn as judges, poised to observe what was meant to remain unseen. The chamber was dressed for intimacy but stripped of privacy. velvet cushions, golden candlesticks, perfumed sheets, all arranged to mask the truth that this was not a bridal bed, but a courtroom. The shifting candlelight cast long shadows, flickering across faces that tried to avert their gaze while still recording every detail. In the silence, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of silk, even the shallow breath of the observers seemed amplified. They were not there to intrude, and yet intrusion was their very purpose. For Lucrezia, the humiliation was total. From childhood, she'd been used to whispers, to rumors of incest and poison, to her private life dissected by men at court. But this was different. This was no whisper. This was a violation made visible, an intimacy turned into spectacle. Her body, once more, was a pawn, this time transformed into living proof of fertility and obedience. What should have been her most private moment was now a political ritual, witnessed, noted, and certified. The act itself was stripped of tenderness, reduced to a requirement. To ensure there could be no question, the witnesses remained until the consummation was complete. And when it ended, the Este envoys nodded gravely, recording what they had seen. But the ordeal was not over. To silence even the faintest whisper of doubt, the consummation was repeated. Once, twice, and according to reports that spread across Italy, even a third time. The theater of flesh had to be thorough, its evidence beyond dispute. Word of the grotesque spectacle did not remain confined to the chamber. It seeped out into the corridors of power, carried by the very men tasked with observing it. Soon, courts in Florence, Venice, and Milan buzzed with the tale. Italy's noble families laughed behind closed doors and gossiped openly in taverns. The Este had their guarantee. Yes, but the price was that Lucrezia's humiliation became a public story, a scandal that would outlive the candles that burned in the Vatican that night. And yet, scandal was nothing new to the Borgias. If anything, it was their native language. Alexander VI had endured whispers of simony and corruption. Cesare Borgia thrived on his reputation for poison and bloodshed, and now Lucrezia carried her burden. But in that humiliation, something unexpected was being forged. Where another bride might have broken beneath the weight of such a spectacle, Lucrezia endured. More than that, she learned. The lesson was brutal but unmistakable. In a world where her body was treated as a contract, shame could be turned into armor. By surviving the night, she emerged with something undeniable. No one could now dispute her marriage to Alfonso d'Este. No annulment could undo what had been witnessed and recorded. No rival family could sneer about her fertility or her husband's potency. The very act designed to degrade her had paradoxically secured her place. Italy gossiped, but Ferrara could not deny her legitimacy. The Este family had their duchess, certified in flesh and parchment alike, and Lucrezia humiliated, exposed, but still unbroken, walked out of that chamber, armed with proof no one could strip from her. The wedding bed, meant to cage her, had become a foundation. In the candle-lit silence of that grotesque night, something shifted. The pawn had begun to glimpse the shape of a queen. In the aftermath of her grotesque wedding night, Lucrezia Borgia could have retreated into silence, diminished by humiliation. Many women in her position would have lived out their days as shadows, whispered about but never respected. Yet what makes Lucrezia so fascinating is not the indignity forced upon her, but what she did with it afterward. Where most would see only shame, she found leverage. Ferrara's court, wary and watchful, expected her to arrive trembling. another pawn of the Borgias, a fragile bride who carried scandal like a stain. Instead, Lucrezia astonished them. She walked into her new role with composure and even grace, her posture straight, her gaze steady. The spectacle of the wedding night, designed to cage her in humiliation, had in fact armed her. The Este family now had the proof they demanded, and that proof made her untouchable. No whisper of barrenness, no muttered accusation of impotence could threaten her place. This protection allowed her to pivot. She began to cultivate the tools that would transform her from pawn to power. At court, she charmed with her wit, her eloquence, and her beauty. She dazzled not by flaunting scandal, but by offering something the Este had not expected: refinement. Guests who anticipated a Borgia temptress instead encountered a cultivated duchess who quoted poets, listened intently, and displayed a tact far subtler than her father or brother ever possessed. Slowly, the court of Ferrara began to shift its view. Perhaps this woman was not simply a vessel of scandal, but a force in her own right. She leaned into this performance because she understood that court life was its own kind of theater. If her body had been turned into a stage, then why not seize control of the script? She began hosting salons, gatherings where scholars debated Plato, poets recited verses, and musicians filled the rooms with song. These were not frivolous entertainments, but carefully curated spectacles of intellect and taste. In a society where women were so often dismissed as ornaments, Lucrezia became the orchestrator of culture, the duchess who turned scandal into sophistication. Her strategy was not limited to charm. She also turned toward piety, funding convents, endowing churches, and commissioning religious artworks. It was no coincidence. By linking her name to faith and charity, she began laundering her reputation. A woman once whispered about in the language of incest and poison was now associated with devotion, patronage, and refinement. This was politics as theater, and Lucrezia had learned to play it better than anyone expected. The whispers did not vanish overnight. Italy still remembered the Vatican spectacle, still gossiped about her first annulment and her second husband's bloody death. But Lucrezia realized something profound. She could not erase the whispers, so she would drown them. Each poem recited in her salon, each convent she supported, each decree she signed when Alfonso was absent of these layered new narratives over the old. She transformed her shame into a foundation, a place to build something more enduring. What is striking is how deliberate it all seems. She could have retreated into bitterness or despair, but instead, she leaned into the role thrust upon her. In a world where men wrote the rules, Lucrezia learned how to bend them. She began to wield the very tools used against her appearance, reputation, performance, and turn them into weapons of influence. For the Est, this was unexpected. They had feared a scandalous bride, a liability forced upon them by the Pope's wealth. Instead, they found a duchess who elevated their court. Her salons became hubs of learning. Her elegance softened the family's stern reputation, and her presence turned Ferrara into a cultural beacon. Slowly, the whispers shifted. People began to say that Lucrezia was not merely Borgia poison, but also Este refinement. From pawn to performer, from performer to orchestrator. That was the trajectory she forged. And though her father and brother had treated her as expendable, in Ferrara she began to carve out something rare in Renaissance Italy, a space for a woman to wield authority not as a mistress behind the curtain, but openly, as the duchess who turned shame into power. Over the years that followed, Lucrezia Borgia did something few thought possible. She remade herself, not as a pawn of Rome, but as the undisputed Duchess of Ferrara. The city she entered under suspicion and scandal became the stage upon which she would display her resilience, her intellect, and her authority. The very family that had once doubted her now depended on her to uphold their prestige. Ferrara itself was no small provincial court. Nestled in northern Italy, it was a center of art, music, and learning. The Este dynasty had long cultivated refinement, surrounding themselves with painters, poets, and architects. Yet even within this sophisticated environment, Lucrezia managed to stand out. Her salons attracted humanists, scholars, and writers who debated philosophy under her patronage. She welcomed poets who recited verses in her honor, and she nurtured musicians who transformed the soundscape of the court. Slowly, Ferrara became synonymous with brilliance, its reputation spreading across Italy and beyond, and much of that luster was credited to its duchess. But Lucrezia was not only a patroness of art and letters, she was also a ruler in practice, particularly when her husband, Alfonso d'Este, was absent on military campaigns. In those times, the duchy looked to her for leadership. She signed decrees, corresponded with ambassadors, and managed the affairs of state with a pragmatism that surprised even her critics. Where her father and brother had ruled with brutality and audacity, Lucrezia governed with patience and subtlety. She listened, she mediated, and she made decisions that balanced firmness with grace. The people began to see her not as the Pope's daughter, but as their duchess, one who acted with responsibility and care. Her reputation transformed accordingly. The same Italy that once mocked her humiliation now whispered a different name for her, La Buona Duchessa, the Good Duchess. It was a title earned not through fear or intimidation, but through years of measured governance and public devotion. Even enemies of the Borgias, who had once scorned her, admitted grudging respect for the woman who seemed to embody the best of Ferrara. She also continued her careful cultivation of piety. Lucrezia endowed convents and encouraged the education of young women, ensuring that her name was linked to virtue as much as to scandal. She commissioned religious works that carried her image, but not as a temptress or a pawn, rather as a devout, dignified matron. Every brushstroke, every gilded panel was part of a deliberate reimagining of her identity. In her private life, she bore children, securing the dynasty's future and further solidifying her position. Her fertility, once cruelly questioned and publicly proved, now became another pillar of her legitimacy. As mother to the heirs of Ferrara, she was no longer a bargaining chip in someone else's game, but the cornerstone of the Este line. Yet for all her outward grace, Lucrezia never lost the edge of someone who had lived through humiliation. Behind her poise lay the memory of annulments, of blood on the Vatican steps, of curtains drawn aside on her wedding night. These experiences did not vanish. They hardened into lessons. She knew how fragile power was, how quickly favor could turn to exile, how easily love could become a liability. And so she walked carefully, weaving her authority through charm and diplomacy rather than force. In time, even the gossip began to change. No longer was she spoken of as merely the Pope's daughter, tainted by scandal. Instead, she was remembered for the glittering court she presided over, the poets and scholars she supported, and the stability she brought to Ferrara. The transformation was remarkable. The very woman whose body had been displayed as proof of alliance had managed to control the narrative, recasting herself from a symbol of disgrace into a beacon of refinement. Lucrezia Borgia had become what her family never expected her to be, not merely useful, not merely survivable, but indispensable. History is rarely kind to women who live in the shadows of powerful men. They are remembered in fragments through scandal, rumor, or the words of those who sought to diminish them. Lucrezia Borgia is no exception. For centuries, her name carried the weight of infamy, tangled in whispers of poison and incest, immortalized as a femme fatale rather than a ruler, patron, or strategist. Yet when we peel back the layers of gossip, another picture begins to emerge, one of resilience, reinvention, and quiet mastery of power. Scholars still debate her inner life. Was she merely a victim, tossed from husband to husband by the ruthless hands of her father and brother? Or was she more an actress who learned her role so well that she began to direct the play herself? Her letters, carefully composed and politically astute, never reveal more than she intended. They offer glimpses of warmth, of piety, of maternal devotion, but they never betray her true thoughts. Was her charm genuine or calculated? Was her devotion born of faith or necessity? The mystery remains, and perhaps that is her greatest triumph, that she never allowed history to fully trap her. What cannot be denied is the transformation. The young woman humiliated on her wedding night became a duchess respected by her people, cherished by scholars, and remembered as la buona duchessa. She turned shame into leverage, whispers into applause, and scandal into a foundation for legacy. The Este family, once so wary, grew to rely on her. The city of Ferrara flourished under her influence, both culturally and politically. And when she died in 1519, not yet 40, she left behind not a caricature of vice, but a duchy that mourned her loss. Yet the duality persists. To some, she will always be the Pope's daughter, tainted by rumors of poison and sin. To others, she is the duchess who endured humiliation and rose above it, mastering the art of survival in a world designed to crush women like her. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps that is why her story continues to fascinate, because it resists simple categorization, because it reminds us that power can take many forms, and because it shows how a woman, stripped of privacy and dignity, could still find ways to wield influence in a world ruled by men. The irony is inescapable. The marriage bed meant to degrade her became the foundation of her throne. The witnesses who stood in judgment gave her the very proof she needed to secure her future. What was intended as her greatest humiliation became her greatest weapon. From pawn to duchess, from scandal to reverence, Lucrezia Borgia's story is a reminder that history's stage is never truly fixed. Even in the darkest theater, an actress can seize control of the script. And so her legacy lingers, half truth, half legend. A woman caught between the venom of her family's reputation and the dignity she forged for herself. To some, she remains a warning. To others, an inspiration. To all, she is unforgettable.